So what have we discovered here? We've discovered that any species that exempts itself from the rules of competition ends up destroying the community in order to support its own expansion. Any species, including man? Yes, obviously. That's in fact what's happening here. So you see that this, at least this, is not some mysterious wickedness peculiar to the human race. It isn't some imponderable flaw that man has made the people of your culture the destroyers of the world. No, the same thing would happen with any species, at least with any species strong enough to bring it off, provided that every increase in food supply is answered by an increase in population. Given an expanding food supply, any population will expand. This is true of any species, including the human. The takers have been proving this here for 10,000 years. For 10,000 years, they've been steadily increasing food production to feed an increased population, and every time they've done this, the population has increased still more. I sat there for a minute thinking. Then I said, Mother Culture doesn't agree. Certainly not. I'm sure she disagrees most strenuously. What does she say? Well, she says that it's within our power to increase food production without increasing our population. To what end? Why increase food population? Well, to feed the millions who are starving. And as you feed them, will you extract a promise that they will not reproduce? Well, no, that's not part of the plan. So what will happen if you feed the starving millions? They'll reproduce, and our population will increase. Without fail. This is an experiment that has been performed in your culture annually for 10,000 years, with completely predictable results. Increasing food production to feed an increased population results in yet another increase in population. Obviously, it has to have this result, and to predict any other is simply to indulge in biological and mathematical fantasies. Even so, I thought some more, Mother Culture says that if it comes to that, birth control will solve the problem. Yes, if you're ever foolish enough as to get into conversation on this subject with some of your friends, you'll find they have a great sigh of relief when they remember to make this point. Whew, off the hook. It's like an alcoholic who swears he'll give up drink before it ruins his life. Global population control is always something that's going to happen in the future. It was something that was going to happen in the future when you were 3 billion in 1960. Now, when you're 5 billion, it's still something that's going to happen in the future. True. Nevertheless, it could happen. It could indeed, but not as long as you're enacting this story. As long as you're enacting this story, you will go on answering famine with increased food production. You've seen the ads for sending food to starving peoples around the world? Yes. Have you ever seen ads for sending contraceptives? No, never. Mother Culture talks out of both sides of her mouth on this issue. When you say to her, population explosion, she replies, global population control. But when you say to her, famine, she replies, increased food production. But as it happens, increased food production is an annual event, and global population control is an event that never happens at all. True. Within your culture as a whole, there is in fact no significant thrust toward global population control. The point to see is that there never will be such a thrust so long as you're enacting a story that says the gods made the world for man. For as long as you enact that story, Mother Culture will demand increased food production today and promise population control tomorrow. Yes, I can see that, but I have a question. Proceed. I know what Mother Culture says about famine. What do you say? I say nothing, except that your species is not exempt from the biological realities that govern all other species. But how does that apply to famine? Famine isn't unique to humans. All species are subject to it everywhere in the world. When the population of any species outstrips its food resources, that population declines until it's once again in balance with its resources. Mother Culture says that humans should be exempt from that process, So when she finds a population that has outstripped its resources, she rushes in food from the outside, thus making it a certainty that there will be even more of them to starve in the next generation. But the population is never allowed to decline to the point at which it can be supported by its own resources. Famine becomes a chronic feature of their lives. Yes, a few years ago, I read a story in the paper about an ecologist who made the same point at some conference on hunger. Boy, did he get jumped on. He was practically accused of being a murderer. Yes, I can imagine. His colleagues all over the world understand perfectly well what he is saying, but they have the good sense not to confront Mother Culture with it in the midst of her benevolence. If there are 40,000 people in an area that can only support 30,000, it's no kindness to bring in food from the outside to maintain them at 40,000. That just guarantees that the famine will continue. True, but all the same, it's hard to just sit by and let them starve. This is precisely how someone who imagines that he is the world's divinely appointed ruler. I will not let them starve. I will not let the drought come. I will not let the river flood. It is the gods who let these things happen, not you. A valid point, I said. Even so, I have one more question on this. Ishmael nodded me on. We increase food production in the U.S. tremendously every year, but our population growth is relatively slight. On the other hand, population growth is steepest in countries with poor agricultural production. This seems to contradict your correlation of food production with population growth. He shook his head in mild disgust. The phenomenon as it's observed is this. Every increase in food production to feed an increased population is answered by another increase in population. This says nothing about where these increases occur. I don't get it. An increase in food production in Nebraska doesn't necessarily produce a population increase in Nebraska. It may produce a population increase somewhere near India or Africa. I still don't get it. Every increase in food production is answered by an increase in population somewhere. In other words, someone is consuming Nebraska's surpluses. If they weren't, Nebraska's farmers would stop producing those surpluses pronto. True, I said, and spent a few moments in thought. Are you suggesting that first world farmers are fueling the third world population explosion? Ultimately, he said, who else is there to fuel it? I sat there staring at him. You need to take a step back from the problem in order to see it in global perspective. At present, there are 5.5 billion of you here, and though millions of you are starving, you're producing enough food to feed 6 billion. And because you're producing enough food to feed 6 billion, it's a biological certainty that in 3 or 4 years, there will be 6 billion of you. By that time, however, even though millions of you are still starving, you'll be producing enough food for 6.5 billion, which means that in another 3 or 4 years, there will be 6.5 billion. But by that time, you'll be producing enough food for 7 billion, even though millions of you will still be starving, which means that in another 3 or 4 years, there will be 7 billion of you. In order to halt this process, you must face the fact that increasing food production doesn't feed your hungry. It only fuels your population explosion. I see that. But how do we stop increasing food production? You do it the same way you stop destroying the ozone layer, the same way you stop cutting down the rainforests. If the will is there, the method will be found.